Right, so good morning and a very warm welcome to all of you to day 3 of the Asian Evaluation Week. So today, of course, as you can see there, the plenary is From Crisis to Resilience, Leveraging Emergency Response for Long-Term Development. The title speaks to a very critical evolution in how we need to respond to crisis. Whether it's a pandemic, conflict, or a climate disaster, it is no longer just a moment of emergency. It's a fork in the road. It can either deepen fragility or become a springboard for transformation. The goal is not just to recover, but to rebuild better, stronger, and more inclusively. We've been speaking about how interconnected crisis is and how it is the new normal. Now, some of you, I think many of you will be going to see the Terracotta Warriors tomorrow. A thought came to my head. That was 2,000 years ago. The first emperor of China, he set the Qing dynasty, got the entire country together, built these terracotta warriors, and then in one intrigue, he dies suddenly. His sons are killed one after the other. The country is in complete mayhem. What if it were today? Today, some powers would be lending support to the intrigue, people who are doing the intrigue. Some people would be offering asylum to the sons who were killed. Some people would be trying to bring about peace. So this is the interconnected world that we are living in today, and the interconnectedness increases as we go. Thus, the need to address crisis as a very wholesome, not just as a one-off event. I'll give you examples. Recently in Pakistan, it's once again grappling with floods. Over 800 lives have been lost. ADB has lent support, it has mobilized emergency support, but the real challenge is ensuring that recovery efforts don't just restore what was lost, but lay the foundations for long-term resilience. We also saw what happened in Sri Lanka, and it's not just a moment of crisis, it must be embedded in systems long before the storm hits. And with that, I'd like to say that that is probably the heart of the conversation that we'll have today. How can emergency responses be designed not just to save lives, but to shape development pathways and be more sustainable, inclusive, and future ready? At this point, I'd like to invite Nassreena Baddiri. She's a Senior Evaluation Specialist at the Asian Development Bank, and she's going to speak about some of the findings of the recent topical paper on this very theme. So, Nash, may I call you on the stage?
Thank you, Saleha. Good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to be here with all of you today. I will be presenting IED's topical paper on ADB support for the transition from crisis response to long-term development in Asia and the Pacific. As Manny highlighted in the opening session, when we look at today's development landscape relative to a decade ago, what we see is not a single crisis, but a cluster of interconnected challenges. The lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic remain profound, with millions of people pushed into poverty, reversing years of progress in poverty reduction, compounded by geopolitical tensions, and layered on top of that is the reality of heightened climate risks, which are hitting communities already under stress. The big implication here is that it's not simply about development slowing down, it is about decades of hard-won progress being undone. Today, rapid urbanization and higher population densities mean that the impacts of crisis are far more severe. Rather than reacting to shocks as isolated events, it becomes an opportunity to manage complex, multifaceted risks in a way that unlocks multiple long-term dividends. This requires a shift from coping to resilience, working to protect development gains, and designing crisis response to maximize impact. IED's paper explores how ADB has responded to crisis, whether it's socioeconomic shocks, disaster triggered by natural hazards, and conflicts. And here, looking at how Build Back Better principles have been incorporated in ADB's crisis response. The study reviews about 127 sovereign operations tagged as emergency response, plus 389 technical assistance operations from 2010 to 2023, focusing on how ADB integrates risk reduction and preparedness. It also compares ADB's approaches with other IFIs and combines portfolio analysis, econometrics, among others, to draw lessons. In short, the aim is to understand what works, what doesn't, and how ADB can strengthen its role in helping countries recover stronger from crises. ADB is positioning itself as a comprehensive and adaptive crisis manager in the region. Its risk-layered and continuum approach signifies a move towards tailored and sustained engagement. Here's a quick rundown of ADB's approaches to incorporate ex-ante risk reduction preparedness into ex-post crisis and emergency response. So the core concept of Build Back Better is inherently multidimensional. As shown in this slide, the framework is anchored in 4 key principles, which is included in ADB's crisis and disaster response as well. And these underscore that effective crisis recovery is not solely about meeting urgent needs, it's about future-proofing societies and economies, ensuring that they're better prepared for the next shock while advancing long-term development outcomes. Now let's explore each of these principles as well, starting with timely crisis response. As we all know, timeliness is at the heart of effective crisis response. ADB has made important progress in terms of crisis financial preparedness through instruments such as Contingent Disaster Financing, or CDF, and the Countercyclical Support Facility, which enable the rapid mobilization of resources when they are urgently needed. This is complemented by flexibility in business processes that allow for faster approvals compared to standard non-crisis procedures. This approach has been demonstrated in the Pacific, where CDF has provided rapid assistance in response to disasters. However, while approval timelines have been shortened, averaging just about 2 months, this has not translated into rapid implementation on the ground. Key requirements such as procurement, financial management, and safeguards are often deferred to the implementation stage. There's also a trade-off between speed and due diligence. In crisis situations, the limited time available for preparation can constrain thorough needs assessments and risks evaluations. Let's move to risk reduction and building back safe. ADB has been shifting from a reactive to a more proactive approach in crisis response, increasingly using a risk-layered approach. This involves leveraging detailed risk information to design integrated finance plans that anticipate shocks rather than simply respond to them. A key part of this is building a stronger foundation before the next crisis hits, and here we see that technical assistance plays an important role, helping countries develop ex-ante solutions for disaster management and embedding forward-looking measures. But still, gaps remain, particularly in terms of institutional capacity building and governance assessments, which lack a comprehensive approach. Let's now turn to inclusiveness. Truly effective crisis response must be fair and must reach everyone affected, especially the most vulnerable. Yet ensuring this in practice is often a key challenge. It requires a clear understanding of how risks affect different groups by income level, age, gender, or disability. But in many contexts, the necessary data is limited or incomplete. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated gender inequalities, and in IED's 2024 gender evaluation, we found out that because of limited gender disaggregated data, we also are quite limited in terms of understanding whether women benefited equitably from these programs. So the principle of inclusiveness, therefore, is not just about having the right policies in place, but about ensuring that systems and information needed to implement them are effectively available. Finally, let us turn to the principle of building economic potential. Effective crisis response is not only about restoring what was lost, it must also generate sustained productivity, livelihoods, and growth. Policy-based loans are quite important here, providing governments with rapid resources while also creating a platform for ongoing policy dialogue and reform. Flexibility in crisis financing is essential, but it must be coupled with a clear connection to long-term development projects as well as regular assistance. Okay, now that we've looked at the 4 principles of BBB, let's look at crisis response across countries. And here we see clear patterns in what separates higher performing crisis operations from lower performing ones. On the higher performing sides, governments act with agility. They're able to make timely adjustments, quickly deploy resources, and importantly, leverage pre-existing systems such as social protection systems, for example, as well as delivery mechanisms. So they don't reinvent the wheel in the middle of a crisis. At the same time, these are anchored in strong institutional frameworks that allow for coordination across agencies and partners. In contrast, lower performing projects often struggle with fragmentation. Institutions operate in silos, responsibilities are unclear, and the capacity to implement is limited. This leads to choke points in logistics and delivery. Coordination mechanisms tend to be weak, so instead of a unified response, we see ad hoc short-term arrangements. Okay, so I'll go through this slide very quickly. In discussing crisis response delivery, it is important to recognize the systemic bottlenecks that often undermine effectiveness. These are systemic issues, targeting and inclusion gaps, implementation constraints, as well as monitoring and data limitations. These bottlenecks are not isolated problems. Together, they highlight why crisis response must go beyond short-term interventions to focus on long-term solutions. Drawing on these lessons, we can identify 3 pathways for shifting from immediate crisis response to resilience. First, on policy innovations, which enable development organizations and governments to strengthen institutional frameworks and improve coordination, as well as strengthening proactive crisis response. In terms of technological advancements, these actually provide the tools from digital systems, early warning mechanisms, to climate adaptation technologies that deliver the speed and data needed for real-time informed decisions. And lastly, community-driven approaches are quite an important pathway, particularly in ensuring local ownership and sustainability. And by empowering communities through participatory planning and stronger grassroots organizations, recovery can be more inclusive and resilience is built from the ground up. What makes this effective is the careful sequencing of support, as these efforts are interconnected and mutually reinforcing to support the transition to long-term development and resilience in the region. That ends my presentation, and looking forward to the panel discussion as well.
Thank you very much, Nash. And now I'll request the panelists, as I announce your names, to come and join Nash on the stage. We have AD Justine Diokno Sicat, alternate Executive Director, Board of Directors at the Asian Development Bank. Edward Rees, Senior Fragility and Resilience Specialist, Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department, again at the Asian Development Bank. Director Sarah Tangaroa Teo, Director, Central Policy and Planning Office of the Prime Minister, Cook Islands. Tania Rajadel, Evaluation Expert, Evaluation Division, European Investment Bank. And last but certainly not the least, Stuti Sachdeva, Evaluation Officer, Independent Evaluation Group, IG, World Bank. And to moderate this session, I'd like to hand over the session to World Bank Vice President and Director General of Independent Evaluation Group, Sabine Bernabè. Sabine, the panel is yours.
Good morning, everyone. A very warm welcome to our esteemed panelists, to participants, to this, what promises to be, I think, a very interesting, topical, and insightful discussion on a topic that is not only important today, but will be, unfortunately, increasingly important, I think, in the future. How to move from crisis to resilience. As Nash explained in her presentation, as we know, crises are becoming increasingly intense, increasingly complex and multifaceted, and increasingly recurring. And this is having an impact, not only a short-term impact in creating immediate humanitarian and economic needs, but also affecting longer-term development. And so the question is, to address these challenges, how can we move beyond just short-term coping mechanism to strategies that also, at the same time, deliberately integrate resilience, sustainability, and inclusiveness from the outset to make sure that we emerge from crises stronger and not more fragile. And so to discuss this important topic, we have a very esteemed panel. And I will start by inviting each panel member to give a very brief, lightning highlight of the work that they're doing in this field, and then we'll have a chance to delve more deeply into specific questions and also engage, I hope, very actively with you, the participants. So without further ado, let me start by handing over to Director Sarah Teo, who is going to give us the perspective from the Cook Islands government. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sabine. Kia ora, ni hao, and a warm Pacific greetings to everyone. And it is a privilege for us to share our Cook Islands story. And it's a story that is woven in the Pacific region, a region that is highly vulnerable to climate change and natural disasters. And despite our differences, the Pacific solidarity is that we enhance our resilience brilliance with relational centered strategies. In the past month, the Cook Islands celebrated its 60 years of self-governance in free association with New Zealand. And this month, Papua New Guinea is celebrating their 50 years of independence. And as we reflect our journey of sustainable development with the challenges that we face with climate change, with our natural disasters, with the natural disasters that's happening, it is an opportunity for us to stop, take stock, chart our map or rechart our map in building a better and resilient future. A little bit of context of the Cook Islands. It is a BOSS, acronym for Big Ocean State, with an EEZ of approximately 2 million square kilometers, with a resident population of 17,000 spread over 15 islands. It's one of the most beautiful tropical islands in the world. So our economy is heavily dependent on tourism. But being remote adds cost and pressure. Despite our vulnerabilities, the Cook Islands became the Pacific's first developed island nation in 2019. At the same time, the country developed its first 100-year National Sustainable Development Agenda, and with a big vision that our people articulated, well-being for all. Our people define well-being as being happy, healthy and comfortable, which we have 15 pledges around responsibilities, resource guardianship, resilience, innovation, you name it. It is the foundation of our national planning and our compass. This 100-year vision cascades, just in case anybody's asking that question right now, cascades into 25-year intergenerational strategic planning and 5-year actionable scorecard, providing a framework for us to track our progress. Now, our first 5-year scorecard for 2020-25 is nearly up for evaluation, so SOS. Ironically, in launching our new NSCA, on top of the ODA graduation, COVID came. This crisis was an opportunity for us to see where we needed to make changes at the infancy of that agenda. The vision of well-being for all was still relevant, and it guided us during the crisis. People wanted to be happy, healthy, and comfortable. Happy to share of our experiences later with the discussion. Thank you, Sabine.
Thank you very much, Director Sarah, for that quick lightning overview of what we'll discuss later. And I'd like to bring in now alternate Executive Director of the ADB, Justine Sicat, to also give another government perspective from the perspective of the Philippines. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sabine, Ni hao, and shasha to IED and all of our Chinese colleagues here in organizing and inviting me here. Interestingly enough, I wrote a couple of chapters on the COVID-19 fiscal response to the pandemic, and my chapter was entitled Building Back Better for Inclusive Growth Through Innovative Public Sector Governance. This was published back in 2021. In any case, what I'll be sharing with you is similar to the what works and what doesn't layout of the IED. So what worked during the COVID-19 pandemic was the decisive action of the national government. The President immediately declared a state of national public health emergency, which triggered a systems approach. We have a decentralized structure in the case of the Philippines, and it allowed local government units to tap their mandated 5% disaster risk reduction and management fund without having to declare state of local emergency. So that overhauled that. It also triggered in our health systems the response for reporting of notifiable diseases. So there was also that trigger. At the same time, on the monetary side, the monetary authorities during the start of the pandemic did something unthinkable according to economic theory. They lent to the national government because they knew that the national government needed funds to be able to give assistance where it was needed. Now, what didn't work? So this picture here, it shows you an example of a national government social amelioration program that was in response to the pandemic. They wanted to give transfers to the poorest of the poor. We did have a national registry for our 4Ps, a conditional cash transfer program, but the challenge was we also had other social protection programs run at the national government level. And these did not talk to each other. The lack of interoperable databases and information systems for registries, it caused the Department of Social Welfare and Development to issue a department memorandum that would allow these programs to share the beneficial lists. But it doesn't stop there. They had to vet at the local government level. Some local governments had orderly registries, but for some there wasn't, and that caused the first picture on the left. People were queuing, not social distancing, in order to register for the social amelioration program. Assistance was also given to small businesses as well, and the same process followed. Now, the lack of interoperable databases really was one of my key findings and recommendations, and was also found here, which is why I was happy to hear about it, validated in the study of IED. Now, what has the national government been doing since? So since then, we have been at the policy level, enhancing system integration through a modernized legal framework, harmonized and dynamic social registries, moving towards a unified beneficiary list, and importantly, an expanded digital payment system. So we're working through our national ID, and all of our, we have a local registry called the Community-Based Monitoring System that was institutionalized in 2019 for local governments, and that's what we're working towards. Also developing interoperable databases and registries for households. So the 4Ps, the conditional cash transfer registry is called Listahanan in the Philippines. And we want this to be linked to the Philippine National ID system, as well as the community-based monitoring system, which is something done at the local government level. But also for individuals and small businesses. for labor market resilience in job matching, reskilling, upskilling of workers, and increased registration of small businesses. And ADB has been helping the government through this, so thank you so much.
Thank you very much, AD Justine. I think you raised some very interesting points around the importance of building systems and targeting the most vulnerable, and most importantly, this question of the importance of coordination between government institutions and the interoperability of registries. And I think we'll come back to that later, as I understand that some of our colleagues in other MDBs have also had similar findings through their evaluations. Now, before doing that, let me bring Edward in. Edward, you, I think, will talk to us about the FCB, the context of dealing with this in the context of fragile, conflict-affected, and violent environments. Over to you.
Thank you. Mindful that I only have a few minutes, I'll run through this as efficiently as possible. ADB has been working in southeastern Bangladesh in partnership with the humanitarian operation led by the government of Bangladesh and the United Nations since 2018, about 1 year after the latest and largest influx of Rohingya came across from Myanmar. This picture shows you something quite important, which is the refugee camps, which are stretched along the Naf River, which is the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh, are in very close proximity to Rakhine, the northwestern province of Myanmar, in which there is an ongoing armed conflict. It's important to understand that the population of Rohingya in Bangladesh are an extension of Myanmar. And in actual fact, what has happened is the conflict in Myanmar has been pushed into Bangladesh. Community dynamics, political dynamics, security dynamics in Myanmar are reflected in the camps, just in some cases a few meters away from the border. This is a picture of Kutupalong refugee camp in southeastern Bangladesh. It's the largest refugee camp with about 650,000 people in it. Gives you a sense of the conditions in which people live and how densely populated these camps are. Moving forward, this sort of outlines the sort of history of ADB's response to this crisis. It's been going on now for 7 or 8 years. Indicating the protracted nature of the Rohingya crisis, which I might add, the first large movement of Rohingya came into Bangladesh in the 1970s. So it's actually been going on for decades. What we also see in ADB's response is that we now have the advent of the Asian Development Fund 14 window for community development for the people of Afghanistan and Myanmar, which is a commitment for some years now, where there's a dedicated window for grant funding for the Rohingya in Bangladesh. It's a new development. It's by ADB standards quite, I would say, radical in a way, because we have made a commitment to supporting novel financing, supporting humanitarian operations, either directly or indirectly, in 3 countries, Myanmar, Afghanistan, and in this case in Bangladesh. As you'll see, we have recently, just 2 months ago, approved a large project, partial loan, partial grant, to the government of Bangladesh in order to continue our support. There is a proposed $200 million 50-50 loan and grant to be processed pending next year or the year afterwards. So the trend is going upwards, I might add. Lessons learned. There have been a lot of lessons learned. I would say that first and foremost, the biggest lesson ADB has learned is that we operate in a really dynamic political and security environment, and it's very important for us to contextualize our projects in southeastern Bangladesh against that backdrop. Second lesson that we've learned is that the humanitarian operation running on 12-month funding cycles is large and complex and works hand in glove with the government of Bangladesh. Our projects, which are government implemented, are in the range of 3 to 5 years long. It's a very different dynamic. Our presence, along with other partners from the IFI sector, are sort of encouraging the government of Bangladesh to think of this as a protracted crisis, which long-term development modalities are required. That's a challenge at times, but as you can see from our trending upwards engagement, it's increasingly getting traction. Another aspect which I've hinted at by virtue of the geography is forced displacement at scale in close proximity to the point of origin creates really unique and difficult circumstances, which means that oftentimes projects have to change direction midway through the course of action, which is very difficult, particularly given the circumstances in this particular case. I would also say, which is something which most of our partners have recognized very early on, as have we, although it's taken some time, host communities are core and critical constituents. In southeastern Bangladesh, refugees outnumber the host community by 2 to 1 in some places. Their needs, development needs, cannot be sidelined. In fact, in some ways, they need to be highlighted. Concurrently with that, there's something that we're beginning to appreciate more and more is the economic impact of forced displacement is a critical issue. It cuts both ways. There are strong negative impacts. There are also strong positive impacts. Mitigating one and maximizing the other is a real lesson learned, which we're beginning to take on board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. I think that was, it's very interesting to hear the specific challenges in FCV context and in Bangladesh in particular. I think you highlighted 2 points that are a very interesting segue to our next panelists, which are, the first is the importance of financing instruments that allow us to bridge between the short-term humanitarian response and, as you were saying, the longer-term institution building, longer-term development response, which I think Tania will also be talking about. And the second is this very important need for MDB, government, and humanitarian partnerships and coordination, which I think will also come out in some of what Stuti will talk about. So let me hand over first to Tania.
Thank you, Cindy. So I'm coming at this from a financier's perspective. The EIB group's been on a very similar journey to other MDBs over the past few years, and a lot of the points made by Nash in her presentation really resonate with our experience at the EIB. So in response to this sort of crisis-prone context in which we're all trying to operate at the moment, the EIB has recently updated its approach to responding to crisis and disasters. And we in EV, the evaluation function of the EIB group, have been conducting recently quite a few evaluations around this topic to inform the design of this new approach. So what has come out of it? The EIB group is now emphasizing more in its own institutional preparedness. This involves setting up an inter-service, multi-sector operational response team at the onset of a crisis. And this goes to some of the points you were mentioning, Edward, about the fact that crisis tends to be dynamic with a situation on the ground that's constantly evolving. So in recognition of this, we realize that there's a real need for us internally to really coordinate between different services our response and also to adapt to the situation as it evolves. And interestingly, at least for the EIB, this new approach to responding to crisis and disasters, in doing this, the EIB has really acknowledged its strengths and its weaknesses, and this is based on some of the findings that came out of our evaluations. The reality is that the EIB group's instruments are better adapted to the recovery and reconstruction phase than they are to the emergency phase. And in doing so, we've identified a toolkit of possible actions that we can take in times of crisis and that can be activated depending on the nature of the crisis, its location, etc. And some of these actions are short-term, but most of them focus on the medium to long term. So again, on this recovery and reconstruction, going back to the need to preserve or to set the sound foundations for long-term development. And this has the merit to clarify for our staff, but also for our clients, for our beneficiaries on the ground, and importantly for our partners, what we, the EIB group, can bring in times of crisis, and also importantly, when we can intervene. So this allows us to offer a degree of predictability to our client countries in times of crisis, and again to our partners, which I think is a good foundation for long-term development. Thank you.
Thank you, Tania. Again, I think we have a lot of cross-cutting themes with the need for a dynamic, agile approach, the need for predictable instruments and a toolkit that allows country governments to know when our institutions come in, at what time and help in which way, and also this multi-sector, multi-stakeholder approach. Now, last but not least, Stuti, I think you will be talking about the World Bank's approach to adaptive social protection.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here. Social protection can play an important role in not only preparing for, but also responding to and coping with shocks. They provide the delivery mechanisms and payment channels to reach households in need. Today, I'll draw on IEG's 2025 evaluation on adaptive social protection, which comes up at an important time as the World Bank Group is committed to reaching 500 million more people by 2030. So let me give the findings in just a few minutes. In short, there has been progress, but it's been uneven. World Bank Group has played a pioneering role in conceptualizing adaptive social protection, which lies at the intersection of social protection and disaster risk management. Lending has increased substantially over the last decade, especially in low-income countries and those affected by conflict. Long-term World Bank support has helped strengthen social protection systems and has enabled governments to expand their systems at the time of shocks. Countries have performed much better during slow onset shocks during droughts, for example, as they had time to prepare, but unfortunately, performance has been weak when it comes to sudden onset shocks like natural disasters, earthquakes, and floods. Many countries struggle to add new beneficiaries, sometimes reaching only 10% of those affected, due to incomplete data systems, as Nash pointed out. Payments were often delayed and benefits too small. Why do these gaps persist? First, political economy. There is a strong bias towards food subsidies and in-kind transfers over cash transfers. Second, institutional fragmentation. As I mentioned, adaptive social protection is a multi-sectoral concept requiring strong coordination between social protection and disaster risk management agencies on the government side. And that often is siloed and unfortunately is mirrored in organizations like the World Bank Group. So it calls for greater coordination, greater focus on systems building, and better performance management in echoing with the theme of adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuti. Thank you very much. I think you also, well, again, you raised a number of cross-cutting issues. I think we're seeing some important themes emerging from all of our panelists. The one you've just introduced, which was also mentioned by Ed, was the question of political economy, which we mustn't forget in the local context. So I think what we've heard from our panelists, as I was saying, is a number of cross-cutting themes. And if I try to bring a few together, I think we've heard about the importance of using better data to target vulnerable groups is essential. Strengthening institutional capacity and coordination, interinstitutional coordination. And I think one thing maybe Stuti didn't mention that came out of our IEG evaluation was that this weak intra-institutional coordination in governments was actually reflected in the World Bank. The World Bank is organized thematically and sectorally, and so there was weak coordination both on the ground and in World Bank headquarters, so an important point there. And the importance of partnerships and ensuring complementarity between the MDBs, the government, the humanitarian agencies, especially, and this point about bridging long-term, short-term finance, and having instruments that allow this flexibility of both responding immediately to the crisis and building longer-term development capacity. And the importance of local context and political economy, and many other points. So let's move on now to, I'd like to follow up with a set of more in-depth questions to our panelists before we open up to the participants for your questions. So let me start with you, Director Sarateo, again. If you could elaborate a little bit on what does strong government, what role, sorry, does the strong government leadership play not just in effective crisis response, but also in transition to longer-term resilience, as we've been saying. If you could share the Cook Island government experience and also the importance of partnering with multilateral development banks, both to shape the national recovery and development strategy for both inclusive and sustainable strategies.
Thank you, Sabine. In the Cook Islands, we have 3 pillars of authority: our government leaders, traditional leaders, and also our spiritual leaders that are founded on our values of looking after our country, our cultural values, and our Christian faith, with the intent to work together to improve the lives and livelihoods of our communities. In light of the question, Ms. Sabine, for us, strong government leadership is not optional. It is the foundation for us to enable us to move from crisis management to long-term resilience. During the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, decisive cabinet-led action allowed us to close the borders fairly quickly, protect lives, and then pivot forward a recovery that restored livelihoods and rebuilt fiscal space. But leadership also meant having a kaiwana, a talanoa, in engaging our communities in looking for those solutions, whether through our local island councils, in the Pāinua, civil society, or our private sector. So recovery was not just about balance sheets, it was also about the well-being, the social and cultural well-being. In shaping this transition, our partnerships with multilateral development banks have been very critical, especially with our recent ODA graduation. The Asia Development Bank remains our largest development partner, thank you very much, supporting us with policy-based loans, technical assistance, and sector investments. For example, an ADB-supported economic recovery program loan, co-financed with New Zealand, enabled us to shift from emergency stimulus to a more sustainable fiscal pathway where we supported businesses and workers and the community in the short term, while putting in place reforms for fiscal sustainability and economic diversification. Remember, our economy is heavily dependent on tourism. So, in terms of this, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank also joined with ADB in New Zealand to support our COVID-19 response, an important milestone for us as it was our first engagement with them. These partnerships show how MDBs can be more than financiers, they can be trusted partners. And this goes both ways, in shaping strategies that are inclusive, sustainable, and most importantly, nationally owned. The key lesson for us is that resilience is not built before the crisis, but built after the crisis, Let me repeat that. That resilience is not built after the crisis, it is built before, through investments in governance, partnerships, and preparedness. Strong leadership enables governments to integrate these elements into national strategies, and MDBs can amplify these efforts by aligning financing and technical support with country-owned priorities. I think I'll end it there. Thank you, Sabine.
Thank you very much, Director Sarah. I think this last point you made is very powerful, that resilience is not built after the crisis, but is built before the crisis with an intentional investment in systems and partnerships and in ensuring that resilience, sustainability, and inclusiveness is determined intentionally from the outset before the crisis. And also the role that strong government leadership can play to support that. And so I think this is a great segue to bring AED Justine back in with the Philippines experience, and we'd love to hear more about the role that strong leadership played in the Philippines in the COVID-19 response. Also, if you see parallels with what you've heard in the Cook Islands, and if you could elaborate on the role of digital technology and how that could be used to strengthen sustainability and inclusiveness going forward.
Thank you so much, Sabine. So, with respect to what Stuti said earlier, she mentioned something about political economy as quite negative perception, but here I'd like to see it as, the strong government, as Director Sarah said, really is what enabled a quick response. The implementation was challenging, as I mentioned earlier, but that understanding what the laws were, understanding what the systems that were already in place, and acting immediately was important. Another thing I failed to mention, which actually touches on what the IED's findings were with regards to procurement and implementation of crisis response, is that the Philippine government enacted a law immediately in March of 2020 called the Bayanihan Act, which allowed for expeditious procurement if it dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic. However that was implemented or whatever, but that was needed, that was necessary because we had a timeline, a fixed timeline for procurement in the Philippines under our procurement law. So that was one thing that actually helped to expedite that. So really an understanding of the laws and the systems that are in place is necessary, and that would require a strong leadership who knows what their job is. Now, a strong leadership also should know what the gaps were, what the challenges were. And when we found this, lack of, Sabine mentioned earlier that within World Bank, departments weren't talking to each other. The same thing I mentioned this earlier within our Department of Social Welfare and Development. We had a lot of lists of beneficiaries and different social protection programs, but there was a law that prevented sharing the information. So we had to go beyond that. And learning from that, we are now moving towards a unified beneficiary system. But to Stuti's point on having it be a registry, so it's not just about poverty now, we know this, it's multi-sectoral, it's also about vulnerabilities. So in 2021 also, I led a team that created a registry, poverty and vulnerability registry for one of our poorest regions in the Philippines, the Bangsamoro region of Muslim Mindanao. And that one included the nuances. So those who are near poor or who could become poor all of a sudden would also be captured by that. And I think that's what the unified, not just beneficiary list for a specific project, but the unified registry for all Filipinos is necessary. With regards to digital solutions, of course we need digital solutions for this, which is why during the pandemic also we ramped up our implementation of the Philippine National ID system. It's still being a bit slow, but we're working on it to get there, so that would be your sole KYC, know your client, ID that's needed. And also in the paper that I had written, I was saying that because people had to queue to get the transfers themselves. If we could have digital solutions, and this just be good through your Alipay here or through GCash, it would be excellent. But for that registry that we created in the Bangsamoro region, we also looked at the coverage, digital infrastructure coverage in that region. We were trying to look for solutions there, but there was poor coverage, no access for individuals there. But we are moving towards that direction, and I think that's very critical. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Justine, and I think this topic of needing better data, registries that are not just unified, but that also include households that are close to vulnerability, so that they can be caught if a new crisis comes. Those households move into a vulnerability, that they are already identified and reachable. I think that's a common theme, again, throughout the evaluations. I'm sure Stuti will come back to that. Ed, I wanted to come back to you in the very specific FCV context. Obviously, everything we're talking about is amplified and much more complex because FCV countries face particular governance and delivery challenges. So, what have you learned from your work on how our institutions can move from being centered on reactive crisis response to, building longer-term resilience and more longer-term institution building?
Sorry. that's a loaded question. I'll take a few kind of stabs at that. ADB recently, actually in 2021, approved what it describes as its fragile and conflict-affected situations in small island developing states approach. It's a bit of a mouthful. And it subsequently put in action a few kind of interesting terms of development by ADB standards. ADB now conducts what it describes as fragility and resilience assessments in fragile and conflict-affected situations, as well as small island developing states. What this actually means in practice is that it deploys an analytic tool to properly differentiate our understanding of the situations that exist in these countries or in these subnational regions. And so, a region or a country which is experiencing serious stress, fragility, conflict, or geographical, it may be in the Pacific, for example, with particularly isolated or vulnerable situations, we take time to try and understand what those conditions are. And we take time to understand what the sort of political economy of those conditions are, which may include issues around political subject matter, maybe societal in terms of what sort of social construct is in place. It will have something to do with institutional capacity of either the government or the private sector or civil society. It may have a structural component vis-a-vis geography or environmental vis-a-vis climate change. And I think the real reason for that is for us to be able to walk in as development actors with a proper assessment as to what the opportunities are set against the challenges in the very specific context of those countries. Our IED department has over the years identified the fact that our projects in FCAS and SIDS countries underperform generally, and that is often because we do not or have not taken the time to properly understand the context and therefore design a project which fits the challenge. Forward to that, I'll give you a very specific example of how that sort of change in behavior was actually implemented, in which I had a small role. As you saw, we have been since 2018 engaged in programming in southeastern Bangladesh, right up on the border with Myanmar, vis-a-vis the Rohingya crisis. Projects in that area are subject to all kinds of different pressures. It may be armed conflict in the camps between groups fighting amongst each other, oftentimes a reflection of divisions within Myanmar, just a few kilometers away. It may be extreme weather events, because as you see, those camps are not particularly well set up to deal with a cyclone or to deal with landslides or floods or other sorts of climactic changes. A big problem is livelihoods for refugees. It is mindful of the fact that our primary client is the government of Bangladesh, and so government of Bangladesh policy is that Rohingya, or as they are known, displaced persons from Myanmar, they have to return to Myanmar as soon as possible, and they are prohibited from formal employment. The fact of the matter is, though, is that the humanitarian operation cannot provide for these people at the level which is necessary in many cases. And so building resilience within those communities for greater self-reliance, i.e. livelihoods, within the kind of restrictions of what the government places upon the situation is a really mandatory approach. And the most recent project, which was approved in June of this year, ADB decided, understanding that there are these issues in place and having done a project-level fragility and resilience assessment, that it would work towards re-engineering procurement systems so that our procurement through our government implementing agencies would be incentivized through local contractors to hire Rohingya labor and thereby drive some of the project funds into the camps and allow people to build greater resilience at the household level or in the community level. And I think this kind of approach is taking hold across the bank in many places in many different ways. I mean, another example, and I'll give you another small example. Timor-Leste, we did a fragility and resilience assessment in Timor-Leste, and not surprisingly, it told us that It has this huge youth unemployment challenge. That challenge is being met or not met, as the case may be, depending on how you view the issue. There are certain government policies in place which really enhance opportunities and some which less so. ADB, as a big development partner, has an interest in reducing youth unemployment, which is sort of directly related to their over-reliance on oil and gas, which has now come to an end, and so they're living off a sovereign wealth fund. Big part of youth unemployment, the negative side, in some respects, is that they have about 25% of the population, that's about 300,000 people, are involved in martial arts groups and other ritual arts groups, which are sometimes a positive influence within society and oftentimes not. And so the ADB resident mission is looking into ways and means whereby we can assist the government to address that problem, particularly through the government's existing systems. One of the major things that they are doing now is they're looking for migrant labor opportunities for this large cohort of young Timorese people. The country's largest foreign exchange earner is now remittances. They've gone from about 20 million in remittances in 2010 to 250 million in remittances in 2024. And so, again, designing our programs to fit the challenge rather than walking in with a sort of, a cookie-cutter approach from a big, successful, middle-income country context, and really trying to slot into what's needed in the place at the time. I could go on, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for reminding us how important it is how important the country context, the local context is, and how we need to avoid this one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach, and how when you actually have a very context-specific approach, you can come up with innovative solutions like the one you just mentioned on procurement that really address and build resilience of the local community, which you wouldn't have if you just came in, as you said, with a kind of one-size-fits-all approach. So I think this is important in development in general, in FCB context, even more important, and in building resilience, even more important. So thank you for that. We'll shift a little bit. I wanted to come back to Tania. During your introductory remarks, you talked about the use of financial instruments to address both the immediate and the long-term needs. And I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on the trade-offs and also the innovations that you've seen at the EIB in terms of the use of these instruments.
Sure, happy to, Sabine. So obviously there's no one financial instrument that can act as a silver bullet, sadly. So to your point about trade-offs, what we have found in our evaluations is that it's really important to shift as rapidly as possible towards the recovery and construction phase, and I think this echoes with some of the points that you're making, including, of course, you, Sarah. What we found is that we shouldn't overextend those temporary measures that we activate during the emergency response phase, because it can indeed come with these trade-offs, and Nash, you were pointing to this in your presentation, in terms of long-term development, because we have to accelerate our procurement processes, etc., which is needed, but indeed means that we might not be paying as much attention to environmental sustainability, social inclusion, gender balance, etc. And it's also important to bear in mind that this is something that really came out quite strongly in our evaluations, is that there is a moment in the emergency response phase where the local authorities are also reaching their limit in terms of absorptive capacity. As financiers, we really focus on getting money on the ground as fast as we can at the emergency phase, but there does come this point when we reach this limit. And what we found is that actually our partners and local authorities really value, as I was saying earlier, the fact that we can commit financing to financing the medium and the long term to help with this recovery and reconstruction phase, in line with these principles of Build Back Better that we were mentioning earlier. And so at the EIB, we've deployed an interesting financial instrument that we call the Framework Loan. It's a flexible investment program that allows the EIB to finance multiple very small sized operations. It can be $10,000 US at a time. So there's no minimum, no maximum to the specific schemes under the operations. And importantly, the objectives and the scope of the operation are predefined early on, and they're approved by the board. But then the specific sub-schemes under the operation are then identified at a later stage during the implementation. And this goes well to the points you were mentioning, Edward, about the fact that the situation is constantly evolving on the ground, and that also the local authorities will know best what kind of incentives or programs to put in place to foster more resilient and inclusive recovery and reconstruction. So we found that the tool works really well, indeed, when the situation is evolving fast on the ground. On average, those framework loans have about 200, if not more, it can be even thousands of small sub-schemes under the program. And it's been very effective in helping, for example, in Turkey, rebuild entire communities that were affected by earthquakes. It allows us to work across sectors with different authorities, different stakeholders, different partners to rebuild homes, schools, but also urban services such as water systems and sewages. It's also been very effective in the Ukraine with the war, helping develop programs for the internally displaced populations. But of course, this works well when there is solid leadership in country, when there is strong coordination amongst partners. And I think this goes back to the point you were mentioning, Sarah, about the fact that resilience starts before the crisis. So this is, again, a financial instrument, but it does require national authorities to be prepared and to be able to coordinate well on the ground for this to be effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Tania. So again, this point about strong leadership needed to build, to put in place the resilience elements before the crisis hits. The question of absorptive capacity that hadn't come up yet, and I wonder if others would want to comment on that. And of course, whether there is a trade-off, to what extent there is a trade-off between the short-term and the long-term objectives. So let me bring in Stuti now, and then finally I'll come back to Nash. Stuti, maybe you'd like to elaborate on your work on adaptive social protection in IEG, and specifically give us perhaps some lessons on how countries can build inclusive recovery and resilience through their social protection systems, and also what you see as the most persistent gaps.
Thank you so much, Sabine. I think when crises hit, we all know that governments need to act fast, but crises also present an opportunity. I would say that they are stress tests. They give us a reality check on where national systems, be it social protection systems, stand. And I would like to draw three broad areas, well, deeper into three broad areas. The first is data systems that enable faster response. Justine, you mentioned data systems, and I'd like to give two very contrasting examples. In the Dominican Republic, the social registry has over 95% of the population registered. So once the pandemic hit, it took only about 8 to 10 days to ensure those people had cash transfers in their bank accounts. Whereas going back to 2010, floods in Pakistan, only 8% of those in need could be given cash transfers in time because of lack of data systems. And I think this contrast highlights the importance of investing in broader data systems. Second, Tania, you mentioned emergency financing. So I think emergency financing is helpful to cushion the impact on the beneficiaries, but also some countries like Indonesia have leveraged these emergency financing during the pandemic to digitalize their payments and enhance the social registries. Other countries, if they use humanitarian channels or other parallel channels bypassing national systems, it is a definite missed opportunity. And lastly, some countries like Mauritania have actually leveraged their annual lean season of droughts to ensure that social protection and disaster risk management agencies, not only on the government side, but also on the World Bank side, work well together. and they actually used it as an opportunity to clear institutional mandates. So I think if crisis can be used as stress test, as a reality check to take stock of what's working and what's not, we can, with the governments, work together towards inclusive resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuti. Some interesting concepts, using crisis as a stress test, building on national systems, of course, and this question of data, and the very good example of the Dominican Republic, contrasted with the one of Pakistan in terms of inclusiveness in social registries, which links back to the point, and I don't know if it was the case in the Dominican Republic, but including people who are households that are close to vulnerability but are not classified as vulnerable yet. Let me come back to Nash. I think we have 15 minutes left, so one last question for Nash, and then I'll open up the questions for the participants. Please start thinking about your questions for our esteemed panel. So Nash, coming back to your paper and very interesting presentation, what lessons would you say stand out across regions, across sectors, on how to embed resilience into crisis response?
Thank you, Sabine. I think this has been such a rich conversation, and a lot of the lessons from the paper are actually also somewhat linked to what our panelists have mentioned. And really one of the clearest lessons in IDD's topical paper is that embedding resilience in crisis response requires moving beyond quick short-term fixes toward approaches that deliberately strengthen systems and capacities for the long run. Development institutions such as ADB have learned that shifting from reactive to proactive approaches when it comes to crisis management is really essential, and that's combining immediate support with measures that mitigate future risks and address the root causes of vulnerability as well. And financial preparedness is quite key here, as Tania mentioned as well. Instruments such as contingent financing, risk transfer solutions such as catastrophe bonds allow resources to be mobilized quickly without undermining fiscal stability. Alongside this, technical assistance is quite key, and by embedding disaster risk management into national planning and project programming, DA keeps preparedness on the agenda, even after the crisis fades from view. Another important lesson is really the value of integrated and multi-sector approaches, as already mentioned as well in this panel. Crises are often complex and it's not bound in just one sector. Linking health, social protection, infrastructure, fiscal measures produces more resilient outcomes than one-off interventions. But these efforts succeed only if governments have the capacity, and at the same time, even within development institutions, when we coordinate within our own departments and agencies and sector groups, at the same time, making sure that communities are actually empowered as well, and that we do promote community-driven and participatory processes that are crucial in ensuring inclusiveness and sustaining local resilience as well.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Nash. I think that was a very nice summary of a lot of the points that we've been discussing. So let me open up now to the participants. It's been a rich and intense discussion. So please let us know if you have any questions for the panel. I think there's mics coming around. Please, if you could introduce yourself briefly.
Hello, my name is Yeonji Kim. I am from the Green Climate Fund Independent Evaluation Unit. Thank you very much for this very interesting session. So I want to ask a question about country ownership. So country ownership, as we all know, is an integral part of the international development rhetoric. We also know that it's key to ensuring effectiveness in development. From a recent GCF-IEU evaluation that assessed the GCF's country ownership approach, we saw that while there are the necessary mechanisms, funding modalities, and processes, they are in place, but it's really difficult to operationalize country ownership because when we say country ownership, we are also asking, the players to ensure a whole of society and a whole of government approach. So in this regard, I want to ask the presenter from ADB. You mentioned policy innovations as a key kind of development pathway, but especially at a time of crisis and chaos, it could be very challenging to ensure consultations with country stakeholders and other partners. How do you go about, coming up with policy innovations in a country-driven manner at a time of crisis? And also, I wanted to ask Director Sarah. So, based on your experience, you also mentioned strong government leadership is key. How did the Cook Islands go about ensuring a whole of government and whole of society approach and implement a crisis management and recovery efforts in a country-driven manner? Whole of society means it's not just government ownership, but you do need to bring in, gender, women, youth, private sector, and civil society. Whole of government, that means hopefully there are no rivalries among, between
ministries. Hello? Yeah, so how did you ensure that? Thank you. I'm done.
We'll take those questions, I think, right away. Let's start with I don't know if your question on country ownership and the fact that while the modalities are in place, operationalizing might be challenging, was directed towards Nash from the Independent Evaluation Office, or towards Ed from the operations side of ADB. Maybe I'll hand it over to both of them to give their views, and then we'll come back to Sarah.
Thank you for that important question, and later on I'll pass it on to Ed, because I'm sure he will also have important insights in this particular case. I think policy innovations is really one of the key pathways to ensuring that we move from immediate crisis response to long-term development, and that requires a more proactive approach in terms of approaching crises. And that includes really focusing on governance and political economy assessments, making sure that we do spend and invest in these assessments and provide a comprehensive scope. This was also discussed earlier, understanding the local context goes beyond just looking at how projects can be implemented, looking at public financial management, for example, and how they can work with development institutions to implement those projects. It's about understanding the legal frameworks in country, understanding some of the constraints that they face. For example, at the national level, if we are having these discussions, they may be able to implement certain projects in a certain way, but capacity may not be available at the subnational or at the local government level. And that's something that should be done even at the early stages of thinking about crisis. And that's really what we want to highlight in this topical paper as well, that development institutions such as ADB and others should be looking at crisis at a much earlier time, really embedding resilience even at the design stage as well. So Ed, I'll turn it over to you.
Is it? Yeah. Wow, big question. I work in a division which is described as the Fragility and Engagement Division in ADB, and my counterparts on the engagement side run something called the NGO Center and the civil society side of things. And this is an issue which comes up frequently, this matter of country ownership and who represents the country. Ultimately, representatives of the government of the day are the persons, office holders, who sign loan agreements and grant agreements with the Asian Development Bank. And so from a strictly sovereign kind of operations point of view, they are our primary client. The fact of the matter is, though, is that in some situations, societies are not as inclusive as we would like. governments are not as representative as what might be the case in some other places. And so it is incumbent upon us to do our due diligence on behalf of our board and those who are shareholders of ADB more generally. And that means when we are examining opportunities for programming, that we discuss the programs in question or the initiatives in question with as wide an array of people as is possible, practical, and or desirable. In some cases, that's very straightforward. In some cases, that's much less so. And I do think, however, in the context of cases where it's less straightforward, there are many ways to ascertain opinions or attitudes about certain initiatives outside of speaking singularly with your main kind of client-facing relationship. There's a whole range of ways that we do that. That's either through different governance assessments, or it's through ADB's new civil society approach, which was approved just a month or two ago, or through these assessments that I was discussing a few minutes ago. It is certainly, in the case of fragile and conflict-affected situations, a matter of the highest priority. In the case of particularly acute problematic situations, operations will be put on hold or paused so as to do no harm. And even while they're put on hold or paused, efforts are taken in order to better understand the local context and the situation in which these activities happen. There is, of course, much more formal efforts to ascertain the kind of positive or even negative impact of projects through Office of Safeguards and other mechanisms. So it is a very important issue, and I would say in my short time with ADB that strong efforts are being taken to address it in a more systematic manner.
Thank you, Ed. Let me hand over to Sarah on this question of how to ensure the whole of government and whole of society approach.
Yeah, very interesting, and it's great when you've been part of the experience that you can respond to questions like this. It was very important for us to engage our private sector and our civil society because the country was locked down. We were heavily reliant on tourism. There was no flights going. So what happened to the pilots? What happened to those who were working in the at the ports? So there was a lot of planning happening. Actually, there was a soft plan, but implementing it, it took leadership from government to have a plan in place, have a structure in place, and then engaging people to keep them busy, to keep them involved, and to ensure that their safety at the same time during the COVID crisis. So we had, for example, people who were working as pilots, who would come and assist with public service activities with minimum funding provided in fixing our roads. In terms of NGOs, we had Red Cross that came and assisted with health-related programs, delivering aid, food across to the households, especially those who were quarantined. We even had churches, faith-based organizations who also had their own way of providing stimulus packages, aid to the households, especially around the area because of the rules that we had to abide by. We took the assumption like everybody's going to get COVID, okay? So we need to make sure that their mentality, they're going through this experience, that they were also being looked after in the long run. So that's how we engage. And the thing is, when we come to a crisis, you'll find as a tribe, people will come together. Those working in the tourism sector, we had to remobilize some of the resources towards stimulus packages, health programs, and sometimes through activities for the young people. But what came out of that experience was the digital. A lot more people were engaging online. And then that's when that's when the digital economy started. So those are some of the opportunities that came from the crisis. And also we had policies around remote working. That was awesome for us. We could work from home while we have our families there. and look after each other. See, the thing with us is that we've got space to go out. We're not locked in 4x4 rooms. And so in terms of the well-being, when we came out of this, the whole of society, when we got back into the system, it was much better. It was much better. We had rested. We had enjoyed our country to ourselves, and then when we had friends and visitors come in into our country, the numbers is just growing. It's just it's growing. So for us, getting our village, getting our people, whichever sector you're from, included in the activities and the operations, that gives them a sense of purpose and satisfaction that they've contributed during this time of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that very inspiring experience, I have to say. So we've run out of time, but since we started a few minutes late, I'm going to, if it's okay, take a few more minutes to take one last question, and then I'll wrap up. So I don't know who the lucky person is because I see a lot of hands up. Whoever has the mic, please go ahead. Okay, 2 questions and we'll answer them in one last round.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all the panelists for your wonderful discussions and insights and the resilience. We have reached a consensus about not temporarily, but build resilience and long-term responses. So my question is, because I'm from mainland China and Marina, and currently I was in an institution related to environmental protection and grappling with climate change. So my question is, we used to just go to the hospitals when we get injured and in some catastrophes. But in the situation case now in China, the extreme rainfalls has hit the hospitals and care systems and inclusive nursing homes. So I have a question: how to ensure the resilience of the key facilities, such as medical and care institutions, usually at MDB level? So I'm very looking forward to your insight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Christoph David Weinmann of Protein Consulting in Malaysia. One question that I have is, we haven't heard anything about surge capacity, right? I mean, we're having a topic on crisis, and crisis means immediate reaction. The technical term normally is we have to have surge capacity. Are we having any work going on to increase the surge capacity to deal with crises in these countries, especially since we think, or we have reasonable ground to assume that these crises will multiply, right, or will increase in the future, right? So is anyone working on that? And the second question that I would have is, normally when you want to create resilience, one very important term is redundancy, right? And we're always in the business of efficiency and effectiveness, where we want to cut down on costs. Now, resilience actually implies that you have backup systems, right? You don't only have one way of reacting to a crisis. Yeah, you have your database, right, and on the computer, right? But the electricity fails, right? You have all of these issues to deal with. So, what are we doing about redundancy?
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. Given the very limited time, I think I'm going to hand the question. You weren't asking anyone specific, so I'll take an executive decision who to hand the questions over to. So on this question of how to ensure resilience of key facilities, such as medical facilities in the face of climate crisis, that was the first question, I believe. And the second is, what are we doing? Are we doing any work on surge capacity and redundancy and backup? Who would like to take either of those questions? So starting with you, Justine, and the others, please put your hands up. Tania.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the question. Actually, the health and the surge capacity, I just Googled what surge capacity is. It's the ability of the health system to adapt to surges, let's say in the health context. I can try and answer that with respect to the response of the Philippines. I did not write on this, but from my readings on what was done, is that we hired people to help address when COVID-19 pandemic cases were coming in, overwhelming the health system. We hired temporary people there who were equipped to do this. Now, I mentioned earlier that we, in our system already, had a trigger. When we declared the public health emergency, one of our laws there allowed for to activate the monitoring of notifiable diseases. So that triggered a whole thing at the local government level. I didn't go into it into detail, it's very extensive. There's a barangay, which is the smallest unit, they're now required. So there was a system also there in order to address that. Was it enough? Of course, we were struggling at the beginning, but there were systems in place already. And to add to that, the system that were in place that I said that we used for the COVID-19 pandemic, they were originally designed for climate. Because the Philippines is one of the most frequently hit by typhoons, by earthquakes. So most of our disaster risk reduction and preparedness were for climate change, either earthquakes, typhoons, or surges. So we used that system that was already in place since the decentralization law of 1991 to address the COVID pandemic. So that's how I'd like to answer those two questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, AD Justine. Tania, the last word is yours.
I'll go very quickly. We're actually conducting an evaluation of the health sector right now, so Marina, stay tuned. In a few months from now, we will share this publication. But it goes back to a point that Stuti was mentioning. What we've seen with the pandemic, it was about learning in crisis, it is that many hospitals and healthcare facilities have actually started to build in this whole point about resilience and how they can better respond to the pandemics and be more resilient the next time around. So I think there's something there. And about the surge capacity, actually this was in my talking points and then I forgot to mention it. So at the EIB, we're taking this from two angles. One is we've been working with local governments, especially at the urban, at the municipality, with urban authorities, or at the municipality level, sorry, to help them develop their own programs to indeed have this surge capacity in the case. Here it's more in the case of pandemics, but of course it would apply to other crises. But we've also reflected on our own surge capacity within the institution because we realized that we had also been completely overwhelmed during the pandemic. And so this goes back to a point about institutional preparedness to make sure that when a crisis occurs, we can mobilize inter-service teams and reallocate resources so we can indeed face this additional need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tania. Thank you very much to our esteemed panel members for very rich and insightful conversation and thought. Thank you for your excellent questions. I'm not going to try to summarize, but I would like to just point out three main things that stood out for me before we close. I think first is this idea that resilience is not a byproduct of a crisis response, but it's the result of deliberate system building long before the crisis hit, and we discussed the importance of strong government leadership in this respect. The second point that stood out for me is on inclusive recovery and making sure we reach the most vulnerable. And the importance of timely data, the importance of unified registries, the importance of including households that are close to vulnerability, the importance of strong national systems, of interinstitutional coordination, and particularly in fragile context, but in all contexts, the importance of understanding the local context and developing innovative and effective solutions that are based on an understanding of that local context. And then third, the trade-offs we discussed between urgency and system strengthening. There are trade-offs, but I think we had a sense that these trade-offs can be managed through smart design, through sequencing, through effective partnerships between MDBs, government and humanitarian agencies, and by using relevant financial instruments that allow us to finance both the short-term needs and the longer-term development goals. And so as we close and look ahead, I would like to leave us with a message to take forward that crises don't just challenge systems, they can be an opportunity to renew and improve them, and evaluation can play an important role here to help ensure that if we are intentional about learning, about adapting from lessons, and about coordinating and leaving no one behind, then we have a chance to build resilience out of crisis response. So thank you all very much, and sorry for the overtime.